again, here we are, part 2. Alright, so you got sort of an overview of things in part 1, especially with looking at how the political left and the political right are very sort of in that context of greed and what they could be in the context of thriving. So that's just a way to sort of start things out in terms of really thinking how does ideology play a major role in how we think about things and how we practice and go about life. It's really, really quite impactful and pervasive. And I think you'll see just an inkling of that in part 1. So here we are, part 2. This video is going to include part 3 as well. So we're going to play with this idea of the phrase pursuit of happiness. What happens to that in the context of greed, and what happens to that in the context of thriving. All right. So the pursuit of happiness. So here's a flow chart that I made up. Really easy. There's a lot going on here. So what I'm going to do is part 2 is going to look at the greed side on the left, and part 3 is going to look at the thrive side on the right. So at the core here is this very popular notion of being able to pursue one's happiness. And just as in part 1, where we looked at sort of the political left and how that gets steered differently in both ideologies, we're going to look at how pursuit of happiness gets steered, or has gotten steered, through the ideology of greed, and how it could be steered through the ideology of thriving. Okay, I provided the link to this. This is a Prezi slideshow or flowchart that I've made. You can see it there. I've also broken up the flowchart in this same slideshow here, so you can check out either link, whatever one works for you. So I'm going to go to the greed side. Okay, so here's the bottom of that greed side of the flowchart, and if we look at the idea of the pursuit of happiness, right, that people have this right, this inalienable right, as it's stated in the preamble to the Constitution. We have this right to pursue happiness, and of course, that phrase alone is somewhat genius to put into a core statement about governing. So kudos for that. How is it impacted? How is it shaped when we start applying other values in society to it? So throughout history, there's a very long history here of greed being the determining factor and having a very widespread impact on life on this planet, for human beings for sure, and certainly nature as a dealing with all of our repercussions. So if you start with greed, right, the primary ideology used to manipulate and exploit people and nature. So when an individual or a group decides that they're going to be led by greed to get large amounts of profit, one of the very first things you need to do is be comfortable with dehumanizing other people, because you're going to have to exploit them in order to get profit. And that goes largely without saying, along a very wide range, for sure, from very dangerous, deadly, to sort of milder versions, but dehumanization nonetheless. You have to exploit other people. They have to work for you, right? So you can pay them, but they're never going to make what you're making. So we're going to take a look at how all of this has been impacted, right? So pursuit of happiness in the context of greed. One of the things that sort of steered me in my thinking was the question of why are issues of the environment oftentimes seen separately than issues of social justice. And, why are freedom minded people oftentimes not caring about either? So uh, that's kind of where I'm coming from with asking about, or at least exploring the notion of how greed drives so many different parts of our existence. So you have to start with this desire to be greedy, and then the next step is to dehumanize anybody else who is different than you. So the way it's been done through history is the primary method of sort of white, straight, Christian, cisgendered, monolingual, male dominance in order to make wealth flow in their direction. That's what we've seen historically, and it's not exclusively, but in terms of global domination, in terms of the highest level of this happening, there's your group, right? And I'm certainly a benefactor of that group too. I'm white male, so as many have noted, this is where a lot of the discussion needs to go, at least for us to wrap our minds around what's happening. Now, it doesn't mean that all people who look like me are for this. It's not that either. But we have benefited from it, and we need to go through a process of talking about it. So, dehumanizing means just turning people into objects that can be manipulated for your own purpose, right? We have to be really mindful of that because we see, again, mild versions through very dangerous versions that have, been present throughout history and certainly contemporaneously. So, what we've seen in history a lot is sort of taking over that space, colonization. And it's really been in three forms here. And I'm using it very broadly. Some folks would potentially disagree and say that it really needs to be one form or the other, that kind of thing, which I certainly understand those arguments too. But for the sake of this one, I'm using it in this way. With colonization comes in three major forms, and there you can see it through the tools that the colonizers have used. One is to simply kill, right? Get rid of people who are in the way, not really exploitable to the degree that that group might want them to be exploitable. So, there's that, right? A genocide. Our genocide refers to killing of women. We've seen plenty of instances of that in history as well. The idea is to remove them from even having a voice. So just ending their lives. A second tool is physical enslavement and imprisonment, which means controlling their bodies, right? And then by virtue, controlling their voices. And if they're not dead, they're really well contained. And we've certainly seen many instances of that throughout history. And the third one is ideological containment. And that's the one I'm going to focus on here. I work in the land of education. So in preparing teachers, it's very important to help teachers understand what ideology is and so forth, right? So I work in the land of thinking, ideas, mindsets, so forth. The first two are extremely important to understand, and I think in sociology and in history and anthropologies and many other topics, they're much more well explored than I could do. But the focus here is going to be on thinking. Okay, so how do we control people's thinking? So if you go up that flowchart and aim towards the left, you'll see that it splits from ideological containment. It splits with one focus on religion. Now, history is filled with a great deal of use of religion to contain people's thinking. And it starts with this notion, oftentimes, with personal salvation as happiness. So this pursuit of happiness is tied to religion throughout history. And for those who are in the leadership levels of religion, they're oftentimes, at least through history, almost exclusively have been men. And again, we're talking about the dominating class here. We're not talking about folks who have been alternative, to this. But so men have been in charge, across the many religions. And that's also done on purpose because that's the group that would like to retain its own wealth and have control over wealth and power and say. So religion is then used in a way for the folks who are not in a leadership position. What keeps them in their place? And religion often offers this personal salvation as happiness argument, which is to say that, if you're a good person here, then your afterlife will be rewarded as such. Um, there's a lot of that throughout many different religions. It's not one religion that has said that, but uh, this is a controlling mechanism to a certain degree because what it's basically saying is that you're not going to receive much in this life, and you have to be okay with it because you'll be rewarded in the afterlife, when you're dead. So that was used quite considerably, quite significantly throughout a great deal of history, a great deal of religions, right? And then you have sort of this fighting across religions of whose is the right religion, who's going to take supremacy, and so forth, right? And Christianity certainly has taken that role, but not to say that there other religions haven't tried to do so or continue to do so. So you see this sort of Christian supremacy that has taken over the planet, but not in an exclusive way, especially not now. But obviously these elements are very much still present today. And white supremacy is oftentimes tied to a version of Christianity. And fundamentalism is something that occurs in all kinds of religions. Violent fundamentalism occurs in all kinds of religions. So you can see that playing through here, right? But religion itself has said over and over, and some religions continue to, especially fundamentalists, fundamental versions of religions, which are very male-driven, are obviously patriarchal. They can be very white supremacist, right? They can be boxing out somewhat violently people of color, and they can be extremely heteronormative, boxing out all kinds of sexualities that don't follow the quote-unquote rules. And the use of some sort of religious text to guide them is, often something that's pointed to over and over. So there's a lot of danger and violence that has been ensued through the pursuit of religion. Religion has acted like an accomplice to the wealthy class. Religious leaders throughout history, I'm talking about now, have financially benefited by being the accomplice to the wealthy class. So there's a constant morphing of what religion is going to do and say based on how the wealth is flowing, right? So there's always going to be a moralizing and a rationalizing within religion to make sort of these moral, spiritual arguments about not just rules here on earth, but rules that supersede this lifetime even. And so it's a very high risk endeavor to go against them, according to the religious leaders, and many, many, many instances of people dying who have tried to do so. So religion has backed things like slavery, as we know, and in many cases continues to do so. Religion has certainly backed controlling women, right? We know that that's something that's still, especially in fundamentalist versions, still very true. And the tolerance of people of various sexualities and various gender expressions is oftentimes extremely low, and comes with lots of violence towards anybody who tends to deviate. Now, why would this be something that has happened throughout history for so long against so many people, right? Religion in many ways has been the uh, an impetus for real violence and real carnage on this planet, but it's not really just religion itself, right? If religion is an accomplice, religion is providing a discourse, a way of thinking, an ideology that is now competitive with others that have even slight deviations from these. And so we've seen this. And um, all the damage, all the killing, all of the really horrible stuff that humans have done to each other, especially humans in places of power who just, decide whatever they think the rules are. Um, all of that has been done with religion sort of in their pocket, right? Um, but it's really so that they can have the most access to the most wealth, and everybody else can have very little. And so there's these arguments in many ways that only God's chosen people get to be wealthy, and so religion, as many have argued, has been a very destructive endeavor on this planet. So, there needs to be some sort of recognition of that, certainly. Um, and when we get to the thriving side, we'll talk about what the possibilities there are. But um, so religion has also been a part of some sort of revisionist endeavor of history, so that we can reinforce these hierarchies. Um, and really what we're talking about here, if we're not killing somebody, is a globalized enslavement of workers, which is still very much with us today. It's evolved, but it's still with us today. The one obviously that comes to mind in most people's minds is slavery in the Americas, especially in the U.S. Until the mid to late, really, well, beyond the 1800s, but because that morphed too into indentured slavery, servitude, and all that. So it's not like it went away. But the slavery of the U.S. is a version. But of course, globalized workers all over are dealing with very, very, very low wages, lots of risk, lots of being controlled, and so forth. So if it's not through religion directly, then it certainly was something that religion set up. That people are now dealing with the ripple effects of that and the different evolutions of that. Okay, so why this part here? This part here is to show that at the base, religion has been a huge part of the social justice problems that we have today. Now, if we look at folks who are religious, who have tried to undo this, right? It's not to say that religion is exclusively causing that, or even today, it's more complex than that. But historically, religion has played a major role as an accomplice to create, sort of arguments from God Himself in many cases as to why this person's wrong and that person's wrong and that person's wrong and that person's wrong and that group of people is wrong and so forth, right? So there's been very, very controlling arguments, to say the least, that have come from religion that have turned into what we now consider to be social justice issues. They were social justice issues then, but that's what we're calling them now. Okay, so there is a root here with social justice issues. I think that's important. It's greed with the accomplice of religion providing the sort of moral arguments for why people need to be subdued and subordinated and oppressed. So connecting these dots is really important, because if we're going to go forward hopefully as a more advanced humanity, collectively, that we can sort of look at where these places have been that are really problematic. Okay. So going over to the right main branch from ideological containment, you see capitalism there on the bottom. Now, capitalism is the way that I'm describing it here, it is not the end all be all bad. So I know capitalists who are watching this probably just went, "Oh, good. Well, that's weird, but okay, good." Well, I'm not saying it's good either. What I'm saying is it's one of the many versions of ideological greed that has been, um, created on this planet. Previous to capitalism, it was feudalism. That was also ideological greed. So what we keep doing is creating societies with foundations of ideological greed, which just simply means we shift around the deck chairs on the Titanic a bit more, right? But it doesn't mean that people are actually really truly any better. So capitalism is more flexible about who can have capital than feudalism was. So is it better? I mean, is it better to get hit with an aluminum bat or a wooden bat, right? So we have to, I think, understand that capitalism is greed. It's legalized greed. It's oftentimes moralized greed. It's tied to words like democracy and freedom, but it's greed nonetheless. And so we are ensnared in a very greed driven, pro greed kind of society. And capitalism is one version of that. So, if where people are talking about capitalism being the root of all problems in our society, I disagree with that because we've had other versions of greed that have done damage as well. So we need to be very careful about how we're thinking about these things and connecting dots. I do think we have to go after ideological greed, right? And we have to have a very different economic system that doesn't use predatory greed practices, which is what capitalism does. When people are talking about regulating, oftentimes they're trying to mitigate the risks of capitalism, and like, how can we still have capitalism but not have the bad parts of capitalism, right? That's I mean, you can think of sort of progressive politicians who ask that question even just a little bit and get called all kinds of things like communists and whatever, right? So socialists. So there's I think there's an important point here, which is that it's not about capitalism specifically. It's really about how we turn greed into an ideology and then turn it into a practice, because we've been doing that for thousands of years, and capitalism has not been around that long. So as we evolve as a society, at some point we are going to evolve. It may not be during my lifetime, but at some point we are going to evolve and realize that greed is at play. We can't just make a new version of an ideology of greed. We can't do that as we've been doing for thousands of years. But right now, that's what we have, right? Greed in the form of capitalism has evolved from oligarchies and feudalism and theocracies. And as I said, it rationalizes and moralizes and creates norms for greed to be okay. So how does that play out in our current society? Well, the norms that come out of capitalism mean that people should be very comfortable with the idea and see it being successful as becoming an employee, a member of the employee consumer class. Now, I mentioned this a bit in part one video, but I'll go into this a little bit more now. An employee is somebody who works for somebody else, right? And they're paid a salary or paid hourly wage, but they're paid to work for them. And they, what's the real benefit there, right? The benefit is that they can engage in the society a bit more broadly through consumerism. The odds of them actually having a reasonable savings account where they don't have to worry about money ever again is not really true. What tends to happen in our society right now, at least, is that people are, born. If they're lucky enough, somebody else pays for their education, and they don't have that debt. But most people do have that debt. At least in the U.S., they do for sure. And then they're trying to negotiate debt from higher education. Maybe they need to buy a car, whatever, buy a home, or rent a home. So they're constantly chasing money to get by. It's the norm that they're not ever really going to have money. Even when they do finally have money, let's say they hit retirement age and have some money in the bank, well, the great fear there is that something's going to happen that's going to land them in long term healthcare facility, and they're going to lose it right away, which happens all the time. So there is no wealth anymore. Wealth is just sucked out, even when people have it. Um, but we have norms that say that's a good thing. You should want that life. So that's the employee consumer class. And so, because there's no wealth really to be had in any long term sense for most people, what's the next best thing? Consumerism. So, consumerism has become the proxy for wealth. It's not wealth, but it feels like wealth, at least temporarily. And that's where we're at right now, where people in our society are they may have a home, right? Somebody who's successful may have their own home, they may have their own car, or we are very weird about what we consider to be sort of financially successful. Um, those are the main ideas of what we think is financial success. It tends to be a home, a car, whatever kind of jewelry you walk around with on your body, whatever. Like, we're very sort of weird about how we display these things or talk about them. Not that real success is talked about in terms of actual fulfillment, right? It's just about the things we have. So we are consumers, and that's our wealth. And so the employee consumer class exists from the levels of sort of very poor employee consumer class through middle, through upper middle, and then affluent employee consumer class. And we use words like equity when it comes to poor and working poor. And as I described in the part one, we run into real trouble when we start using words in this way, because what is social justice in this context? Well, it's to sort of move from poor as close as you can get to affluent, right? Maybe you become one of the super rich, but affluent here is not the super rich. They're doing okay. They would definitely have a savings account, right? But let's talk about what happens along this spectrum from poor through affluent, right? Um, the challenges change financially. One has to feel better about themselves when they finally, can pay off their bills and can pay down debts and things like that, right? That's a good thing. I would love to have that myself. Um, but that is kind of where things more or less stop, right? Because the richer somebody gets, the more they're going to buy stuff and put themselves back into debt. That tends to be the pattern. So you go from having a small house to a bigger house, a cheap car to a more expensive car, right? We keep sort of upping the ante, so to speak, and keeping that debt ratio, you know, with us. Maybe it shrinks a little bit, but yeah, we keep sort of putting the challenges financially in front of us because of greed. Now, what else happens? It's not good to be poor. I would never advocate or say so. It's a horrible place to be. Chronically, it messes with every aspect of life, right? But all I'm going to say is that if all we ever do is view poverty as a problem, we're missing the bigger picture, because chasing the dollar has its own set of problems too. And once you get to sort of the upper middle class to the affluent, what are you really doing? Well, you probably are working 60 to 80 hours a week. You have lots more to pay for, and maybe you have kids. And how much attention are the kids getting? Well, they're probably getting some level of neglect, because you have to be on your devices, on your laptops or on your cell phone or whatever, because work is demanding you be constantly connected to email and all that. So you're sort of losing. You've definitely lost your personal liberties to the business, right? To the corporation or whoever is paying you. Um, the level of quality relationships that you have, loving relationships in your life, are compromised by all of that going on. Kids are growing up not feeling great about their connections with their family and with their parents, and this, happens quite regularly. And so, in a place like the U.S., for instance, we see high rates of depression. We see all kinds of mental health issues. People are on lots and lots and lots of prescription drugs to keep down the levels of anxiety and sadness and so forth, right? So clearly there's a cost to moving up the ladder or moving across the spectrum from poor, which has a huge number of problems, many of which are talked about quite regularly. But my point here is to also point out that the deeper entrenchment in the system of sort of chasing with greed, it doesn't it's not great, right? We don't just get into this land of happiness. It doesn't happen. So the spectacle, though, is seeing people move, which doesn't happen often in our society, but when it does, we sort of celebrate it. And so that's the spectacle, right? Seeing somebody who's now the top of the employee consumer class. And to do so, to get to that top level requires a high level of fidelity. I mean, you're not going to get to a level of affluence by questioning this structure. You get there by following it as closely as possible, right? And and also usually displaying the rewards, the perceived rewards in front of one another. I mean, it's a really terrible practice that we do. Right? It's a system that does us in, and yet we celebrate it. And when somebody reaches the highest levels of it, or higher levels of it, I should say, we give them props for it, and they walk around with sort of the brand names that tell us who they are. I mean, there's a lot of control in this, and so you've heard me use the word hegemony. Hegemony means that we participate in our own problems, like we participate in our own domination in this case. And so we do participate in this structure willingly, quote unquote, right? I mean, what other choice do we have is the other part of that argument, but we tell ourselves we do this willingly, and that these are the benefits of sticking to it. So, really though, should we have a conversation about this? There's a lot of bias in the system, and in many cases it's confirmation bias. Like we are biased towards what we want to see, and then so if we want to see success being financial, then that's what we think we're seeing. We tell ourselves we're seeing, and when we see it, we see it as a good thing, right? So that sort of affluent consumer class becomes a spectacle for people to stay with it. So maybe you're not somebody who's affluent. I'm certainly not. But this is the way in which you keep people in it, right? You see a wealthy or expensive car drive by, and it's just a little like tick, like whoo, right? Somebody made it. Okay, I can do it too. And so there's a lot of that going on in the system. But the employee consumer class is very exploited for the sake of somebody else's mega uber wealth. So that's a conversation that needs to happen too, but very quickly, let's say you're somebody who makes $250,000 a year. It's a lot of money, right? I mean, I'd love to make $250,000 a year. But that's a cheap price for somebody who makes billions of dollars a year, right? Somebody who makes billions of dollars a year, who's the executive in a company, doesn't really care about your $250,000 a year. They just made $250,000 farting into a chair at an executive board meeting, and they don't care about you, right? The only thing that they care about that's related to you is your ability to work for them and continue to make them stupid rich. That's it, right? So there's nothing humane about any of this, except for the fact that people are very much exploiting. A small group of people are very much exploiting a large group of people here. So the employee consumer class is collectively is the exploited class, right? And we need to come to terms with that. We really do. Um, because as a teacher, is that what I want to tell my kids that they should look forward to in life? 40 years of being exploited so that somebody else can get super wealthy off of your, um, your labor, right? Off of you walking into something that probably doesn't provide any level of fulfillment for you, but you do it anyway, and you get paid just enough so that you can pay your bills, maybe, hopefully, right? This is not. This is a bad humanity in general. Philosophically, we know there's better, but in practice, we tend to really limit ourselves. On the bottom right corner ish, right, is the education part of it. So the norms are, it's good to become an employee consumer. You should want to do that. Do your homework so that you can become that, right? Get good grades. Become valedictorian. Do the best you can, right? Go to an Ivy League school and do it even harder. So those norms are really aligned in public education. I would argue that if you did a concept analysis, a discourse analysis, a critical discourse analysis of standards and textbooks or texts, all right, e-texts that teachers are using, you would find this language embedded. And I have done that kind of research before. So, and I have seen that in science textbooks of all things. So this is something that we need to be very, very aware of. I think teachers need to be ideology detectives and really look very carefully at the language that's there, the not just the sort of mainstream messaging, but the hidden messaging that's there too that reinforces it, and what's being omitted, right? So public education moves kids through this ideology of greed with meritocracy, and we have this fetish with affluence as the path to happiness. We know it's not true, but we do it anyway. The primary aim is to make new docile participants for the employee class, the employee consumer class. And that docility is important because that docility not just creates a very passive participant as an employee, but also as a consumer. And that's great for companies that need consumers to become wealthy, right? So for the people at the top to become super wealthy. And so we do things right now. We sort of have this globally competitive corporate STEM education that's like the light, the source of all that is good in our society, and we need to check that and have a real conversation of what do we actually mean when we say STEM. STEM should be prioritizing sustainability. It shouldn't be prioritizing corporate profits or practices that get us to corporate profits. And right now there's a heavy focus on STEM being driven by corporate interest and corporate views. And all this sort of leads up to consumerism, which I said before. So consumerism becomes this proxy for happiness. Consumerism becomes this proxy for wealth. And we need to be very careful about how we see that. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't consume things and all that, but the way in which it sits in our mind, that's the part that I'm really drawing attention to. So, the top part of this is what are the outcomes? Well, I started with why do we see, this is one of the central questions I had in my head, why do we keep seeing nature and sustainability, right? Sustainability at the nature level and sustainability at the social level and ecological level. Why do we see them as so separate? Even in academia, people still talk about them in very separate ways, right? And so that's the top of the flow chart here on the greed side, where we're very quickly moving towards the sixth mass extinction on the planet, and we need to be very, very careful and mindful because this is happening quickly, right? We know climate change is doing quite a bit of damage very quickly. Changes are intense. Just this year alone, we're seeing sort of a polar breakdown, a splitting of what's going on with the atmosphere at the pole, the North Pole especially right now. And so, one could simply argue that our greed has made us the most invasive species on the planet. Humans are by far the most invasive species. Wherever we go, we end up doing lots of damage, it seems, all over the planet. So how could we not be the ones that we need to rein in, right? Certainly worse than purple loose strife. Anyway, sorry, that's the science teacher in me. So we need to do a much, much better job of that. On the other side is where we see all of this social injustices, right? Because of the super concentration of wealth that has happened across our planet. It should never be that 3 or 4 people on the planet have as much wealth as the bottom half of the planet, and that's where we're at. It's disgusting. There's nothing about it that's defensible, but we do it anyway. So, profit as happiness, yeah, we really need to get away from that notion, okay? But the objective, is attained here, right? The wealthy, largely white mass of people who are at the top, mostly white, not exclusively, but pretty close to just about all white and men, that's been attained. So where this started, which was greed of the white male and straight Christian group, yeah, it's largely played out that way, right? It still plays out that way to right in front of our eyes every single day. So that was part 2, just looking at the greed side. Now let's look at the thriving side. So go back to this big flow chart again, and we're going to go over to the right side now. So what happens to the pursuit of happiness when it becomes about thriving? So on the Homo greedius side, right, the Homo sapiens that decided that greed was the thing that they need to follow the most, they have an individualistic, competitive, selfish, scarcity mindset, and selfishness is itself happiness. Whereas on the Homo thrivis side, right, and I'm making up those terms, but it's integrative, interconnected, responsive mindset, and wholeness as happiness, and an abundance mindset. And so we need to be very aware of what all of those things mean. I'm going to take some time to go through them. So welcome to part 3. So over on the thrive side, here's what the whole side looks like by itself. We'll zoom into the bottom part of it. So if we start with thrive and build our way up, how do all of those aspects that are on the left, how do those change? Well, to thrive, it's an ideology to diffuse social power and produce high-quality well-being. We can say this in lots of different ways, but basically meaning here is that diffuse means to spread out, right? Social power should be spread out, and if we move towards a more democratic society, more than what we have now even, more people, more say, more voices, more inclusion of that, more equity, more social justice. So yeah, right? But that's the overall goal here of thriving. And really what it comes down to is that you have high quality internal well-being in connection with high quality external well-being, whether it's community, whether it's nature, it's a combination of community and nature, and the individual. Okay? And it is complicated. It's not easy to try to keep all of those things in balance, but that would be the goal of thriving, is to try to keep all of those in balance. So, first thing we need to do here is rehumanize. And by that I mean we should not be turning other humans into objects of manipulation for our own purposes. But that would be step number 1. At least it's the opposite of decolonization. It's the opposite of dehumanization. So we're going to rehumanize. And that's a big part of what needs to happen in school. We do absolutely need to humanize our students. Our students are treated as pre-employees, right? And I probably should have said that over on in part two, but um, our students are dehumanized to become pre-employees. They're not even really students. They're just somebody else's future employee. So we need to rehumanize and really truly make them students in sort of present time, right? Um, if you do that, then what you end up doing is decolonizing. Right? It's going to be part of the space of you got to open up the space again. So if colonizing was to control the space, now decolonizing has to be liberating the space for nature, for humans, for really everything. Now this is not just sort of a feel good, right? This is where really greed minded people who put their ideas of freedom in the context of greed start to get all kinds of anxious, right? It's all so fluffy, blah blah blah. It's not fluffy. In fact, decolonizing is a really difficult task because we do have to live together and we're going to have problems. But we have to find a way to first open up the space so that people are not being sort of thrusted into exploitation all the time. Because that's what colonization really is. It's organizing in order to exploit somebody. And so we need to organize in order to not exploit anymore, to work together. So tools of decolonizers. Well, one is going to be restore and repair the what's been done. So as much as possible. Of course, it's really difficult to do when it comes to genocide because you can't just make people come back to life. Um, but going forward, there needs to be some sort of reparations. There needs to be some sort of reconciliation, and we've seen efforts uh, like this, and they've had some levels of success. But uh, I don't know that we could ever fully repair, but we can at least make some serious efforts in order to help people and to decolonize them, right? So if they're still with us, there's things that we can do financially. There's things that we can do in terms of helping them have mental health and financial supports and so forth. Deep listening, deep healing. These are things that we need to work on, and it's not easy, but they need to be done. But again, as I did on the other side, moving into ideological deconstruction. So I'm going to go into the thinking part of it. So how do we deconstruct the ideology of greed, right? So we have to deconstruct and build another ideology, one that's flexible, by the way, one that doesn't require, um, sort of entrenched imprisonment to the ideology, right? We need to be able to think for ourselves, critically question, at any point in time, re-examine what's working, what's not, and have serious conversations around those, right? Right now, we're very stuck in greed. We're stuck in personal power, personal wealth, competition. We need to move to a space where we can listen and really discuss where things need to go. And know that's going to take time. This is not something that's going to just happen overnight, right? So what does that look like? Well, if we go to the left side of that branch of ideological construction, what does it look like to redo all of that social injustices based on various social classes and identities and so forth? Well, the first thing, if you remember from part two there, the long discussion about religion and its accomplice activities, religion needs to seriously move out of the way. It doesn't mean that we have to get rid of it, but we have to rethink really, and there has been, there have been efforts to do so, to rethink what religion's role even is. And I will say this, they're either all mythologies or they're all religions. Take your pick. It's not one or the other. Some don't get to be religions while the other are mythologies. They are either all mythologies or all religions. And that, I think, is a very helpful beginning because it gives us a perspective that we probably need, which is along the lines of it's okay to spiritually resonate with the stories, with the narratives, with some of the objectives and moralities and so forth, but we have to also realize that it can be incredibly constraining because it gives other people power. Religion still very much to this day gives people power, and they control others so that they can have status and finances and so forth, right? Um, I can mention names, but I'll stay away from that for the time being. So, religion has to be relocated. It's a diversity of mythologies and spiritual resonance. It's fine to have spiritual resonance, but that might be the stopping place at that point. Humanity reforms itself around preserving difference and egalitarianism. So what it means there is that now that religion's sort of out of the way, if we're going to thrive, we do need to have a discussion about what it means to have egalitarianism, to also preserve difference. Difference is good. We should not all be striving to be the same thing. We need difference. And so let's retain difference because it's important. But also let's talk about how we can be egalitarian about our societies, much more so than we are right now. So you have gender reform, gender freedom, inequality. Gender is along a spectrum. It's not one or the other. So there needs to be an acceptance of that for sure. And to that end, similarly, race. Race is, and again, I probably should have said this in part two, but race as an idea is constructed merely for the sake of exploitation. Race is a false construct. It doesn't exist in any real terms except for the fact that we make them. We make it real, so we have to now live with that as reality. But it's a completely false construct. And it was used exclusively for exploiting one group so another group can get rich off of them. Now, that race exists in our minds, and there's been many kinds of responses to it, and people have made their lives around it because they were sort of forced to. We've created cultural practices around race and so forth. So what I'm not saying is that we're dismantling our cultures and things that are part of our stories and part of our, part of our identities, but we have to dismantle the operationalized version of exploitation that is race. At the very least, we have to do that. If we're going to be anti-racist, that's what we're doing. It's a tricky place, right? Because what we're doing is we're saying race doesn't really exist, but of course it exists because we made it exist. So that's a tough place to be right there. That's a hard thing to understand for a lot of people. But it doesn't naturally exist. It existed because some people wanted to screw over some other people. So we need to be very clear about that. So we're not dismantling, but we're dismantling the damage that's done by race. We're not dismantling culture, because people have every right to practice culture, but not the exploitation piece of it. And then separate from that is sexuality, and the way in which that needs to also be liberated from, all of the really unfortunate ways in which we treat sexuality right now. That's another discussion for another day, but generally speaking, sexuality is also along the spectrum, and it needs to be free to be that, whatever it is, right? People should not be exploited because of sexuality. They should not be, damaged in any way because of sexuality. It's not okay, right? So difference and egalitarianism as happiness and wholeness. That's where this goes. So solidarity in this sense really just means that, let me put it. I'll put it this way. You have a place in the society just as I do, regardless of the fact of whether or not I even acknowledge it. You don't have to wait for my permission to have membership in this society. You have it whether I say so or not. That's true solidarity. And the other part of this definition is that I'm committed to making sure that you do, right? I'm committed to making sure that whenever somebody breaches your membership in this society, that I'm there to be like, nope, this person has every right to be here too. Um, Again, regardless of whether I say it or not, you already have that membership, but I need to be committed to making sure of that. That's solidarity. Okay? So, on to the right side. Deconstructing ideological greed in all forms. So, as I said before in part two, this is about ideology of greed. So we need to deconstruct the way in which that it's been operating. We have to go through a deconstructing process, and that's what is necessary for us to thrive more. So we have to critically examine. We have to ameliorate and remove capitalist practices of domination, but really greed practices of domination and exploitation. Neoliberal ideology is a huge problem in our society. Basically, it just means that money and markets sort of dictate what our realities should be in places where it has no business making those decisions. And we've done a great deal of that. Neoliberal ideology has really messed with schooling big time. Okay. So purposeful, humane exchanges. So instead of having this sort of normed employee consumer class, we are working on a very different kind of economy, which is based on humane exchanges. And it really should be based on contributions. So if you sort of jump to the top of the screen, you see the words responsive contribution. And that means that basically along the spectrum here, from self all the way to global, we're working in ways that are contributory, that are purposeful, meaningful. It's connected to our well-beings, our individual and collective well-beings, and that we're contributing. And we are encouraged to be contributors, collectively and individually, and not so much that it's like a overinflation of the ego, but in a balanced way. So regeneration at the local level, regeneration at the national level, and really at the global levels too. But we need to have global consciousness as we do this. Regeneration is different than restoration. Regeneration is really about bringing something to a level that's better than where it started from. So we're going to regenerate. Restore means bring it back to its more pure original state. Regenerate, we have to really go beyond than, well, I don't even know what the beginning state would be, but we have to regenerate and create better civilizations than we have now, societies than we have now, communities than we have now, right? So we maximize the ability to thrive within each sphere of existence in an increasing collective relationship, which serves as a central frame of reference. There's a multi-tiered social justice at each of the spheres of existence. So spheres of existence means from the self all the way up to the global. Self is one sphere, enwrapped in local, which is enwrapped in national, which is enwrapped in global. So at each one of those tiers, that's what we're talking about here. That's the spheres of existence and keeping an eye on all of them. Equity as a base for analysis, policy, law, education, and wholeness. That shouldn't be a surprise at this point. Equity, of course, is not, for anybody who still has a question as what equity means. Equity means you get what you need, not you get the same thing that everybody else gets, right? You get what you need so that you can function and have a strong quality of life. And so education itself is now going to be very different. There's a drastic change here from trying to condition kids and make them submit to docility so that they can be employee consumers to becoming sustainability minded. And by sustainability, I mean much bigger than it's oftentimes used today. I'm really talking about not just nature, but really creating a society that's peaceful. Not without problems. We're always going to have problems. Anybody who thinks that peaceful means without problems does not understand peace. We have problems, but we have peaceful ways of working through our problems together as much as possible. So, schools are aimed at helping kids become adults who are able to make those kind of contributions and decisions within their communities. And they don't have to just be adults doing that, right? Kids do that too. We've seen many instances of that. Um, but that's what school is. So we've replaced, uh, and I'm really in favor of this, moving towards how do we thrive together and designing the whole mosaic of education with that in mind as the centerpiece, right? So the primary aim is to create thoughtful, critically engaged participants in a community aimed at creating environmental, social, cultural, and economic sustainability. Um, and maybe even the word sustainability is not enough here, to be perfectly honest. Maybe there's something beyond that. Okay, but thriving. How do we thrive together in all of those categories? All right. So as we move to the upper portion of this flowchart, um, similar to the greed side, we see much better practices of ecological, social, and economic. Okay, how do we get to ecological restoration? And how do we get to social and economic thriving? We want sustainable, thriving societies. So this top portion here on the left side, you can read through it, but basically, carbon negative policies. We have to get down to at least 350 parts per million. We're well above 400 at this point. Um, we have to restore our land and water. We have to make sure our atmosphere is in good shape. We have to do a lot of work here to make the planet, much more in balance than what it was. So closed systems of waste and so forth. We have a lot of work to figure that out. And on the social and economic side, there has to be a strong organization of reciprocity, which means a give and take, right? These are humane exchanges. These are exchanges that are built on being in balance with nature. How can we have the individual and collective reciprocity? And if you go back to part one, that's really what part one was about. Was this here? So if I was to put all of part one into one phrase, that's what it would be: individual, collective, reciprocity. A balance of individualism and collectivism that aims at leveraging strengths. So we're not getting rid of either one, and we're making sure that they're both in balance. Hopefully, all of these things collectively moving us towards more thriving, sustainable societies. Whew, that was quite the trip. All right, I hope this was helpful. I think a lot of the big goal here is that we have a framework that we can work with, at least to start, to get us moving down the path. So, if I'm talking about teachers and administrators, here is a framework that we can work with. I will say this much. We have gotten it into our heads that we have to look at data and standards, and that's the only way that we can make decisions right now. And it's incredibly limiting at this point in time. What we need to do is become the professionals who do have these conversations and figure out, even if it's just locally, figure out how education can move in these kind of ways. And if you're a member on a board of education, even more so your job to have this discussion in a public manner. We cannot subsist anymore on the Prentice Halls and the McGraw Hills. And I know they're in some way a response to what they think people want. But between the major textbook companies and their very limited views of what humanity even is, between the standards having oftentimes very limited views of what learning looks like in the content areas, we've got a lot of work to do, and I think we can very easily liberate ourselves of those things, or at least say they're not good enough. We need to come up with something better, or or build upon them or realize that they have stopping points and we're going to go farther than them or further than them. So we have to do that kind of work together. And of course we can, but if we remove philosophy and theoretical thinking and framework thinking and all that from education, we're done. So that's what this is about, right? It's about realizing that we're sort of stuck, we're shifted, um, and no matter how many times we try to slice it, it's never going to work out in a greed context. But if we move towards a thriving context, maybe things will be better. Maybe we'll have a planet that's not so much, encumbered by climate change anymore, and this notion of money and poverty and greed and all that. Maybe that becomes minimized and mitigated, and we can be a better people. So I think ultimately it comes down to that, and this is a starting place. So where do we go from here? Lots of places. It can be curriculum design. It can be how we do administration. It can be a lot of things. What our classrooms look like in terms of culture and climate and treatment of our students and so forth. But ultimately, this is a long term game, right? This is a long game for us. We gotta start somewhere. So, all right, I will leave us with this and with hope that somewhere down the line we'll get there. Alrighty, thanks.